Our next speaker is very well known in grazing circles and in natural resource management circles. Terry McCosker is the director and owner of RCS, and he's also the executive chairman of Carbon Link Limited. RCS is an agricultural-based consulting, training and skill development RTO, which has worked in all states in Australia and also in South Africa. Their premier training product is Grazing for Profit, which has over 5,000 graduates in Australia. Today, Terry McCosker will be talking us through some of the changes he's witnessed in grazing systems over the last 30 years. Welcome to the stage, Terry McCosker.
Thank you, Nicole. I first started looking at grazing management well over 30 years ago, and what confused me was all the terminology. So I had to develop a system to interpret what was in the literature and what was happening in paddocks. And so I developed this system here where we looked at, I've got 5 major groups of grazing systems, from continuous rotational resting through to rotational grazing, multi-camp rotational grazing, and the time control methods. And I based the nomenclature on the plant's requirements. So when you're looking at grazing management, are you looking at it from the animal's perspective or the plant's perspective or the paddock's perspective? And so this array of terminology, and it keeps getting added to. So we've got adapted multi-paddock grazing systems has just been added there as well. So I use this system to determine what I'm reading in the literature and what I'm seeing in the paddocks. But the main thing I want to talk about today is a project called Project Pioneer, which we've run over the last few years. The project covered 1.3 million hectares in the reef catchments in Queensland. So it started in the Cape and went right down to the Burnett Mary Cape. There was initially 50 properties and graziers involved in that project, and it eventually developed up to around 150. The capital expenditure over the last few years exceeded 22.98 million from the producers involved in that project. That's more than 7 times the amount of money that was put into an education and support program for producers. Across the board, over a 4-year period, carrying capacity increased by 14%. Animal production increased by almost 14%. And in some areas where we're able to manage land condition very, very closely, over 29,000 hectares, we improved land condition score by 1 unit within 2 years. And some of those years were actually drought years. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the outcomes from this project because it provided quite a large data set. One of the things we looked at was the relationship between ground cover and water quality. So we've got 3 sites here in central Queensland, and TCG refers to time control grazing systems. The controls were continuously grazed. And you'll notice 2019 was a very bad drought year. And you'll see some really big differences between the ground cover on the time control grazing properties versus the controls. And these were basically just through the fence. In 2020, it rained. On the poorer properties, the ground cover obviously picked up when it rained. And that big change in ground cover. In fact, real change in ground cover on the TCG properties. So rain didn't make a difference to ground cover properties, but it made a significant difference to ground cover on the previously grazed properties. We also looked at water quality. So total solids, you'll see massive differences there in the amount of total solids between the time control grazing properties and the control properties. So a huge loss of soil there. Turbidity, also significant differences, quite large differences in turbidity in 2019. Again, the differences were smaller in 2020, And in 2020, these samples were taken right after the first rain. In fact, that was the case in both years. And even so, after that drought year, even the time controlled grazing properties, total solids and turbidity went up a little bit, but still a difference between them and the neighbouring properties. There was, when we started this project over the 1.3 million hectares, there were properties that had already started subdivision, and there was some data available on the Maya grazing system. And all of these properties grazing introduced to them through this program. So we were able to get a handle on what was happening at scale and with the paddocks. Of the landscape that had started subdivision before the project started, that continued. So you'll see that we went on this particular, and this was across quite a few properties, the total paddocks split increased, the average paddock area decreased, etc. The average graze period obviously decreased. And the percentage days not grazed went up to about 86%. And generally, we'd be looking for at least that sort of 80% up to well into the 90% of total days not grazed. And density, which is the driver of change in the landscape, went up from 1 to 6.5. Now, 6.5, that's head per hectare, is right on the bottom limit of densities. Basically, we say that around about 6 to 7 head per hectare, you can start to see some minor effects of density. So we're only just reaching that first threshold. Yield, interestingly enough, across these particular properties where we had prior yield data in stock days per hectare per 100 mils went up %. And again, that's sort of stuff that we would expect over time. When we looked at density, and we had a lot of data on density, I think we had something like 5,000 paddocks worth of data on this. But when you combine it all across a whole range of properties, what you get is absolutely nothing, which makes sense. So we then broke it out onto some individual properties, and you can see that the orange dotted one there, that's a property with higher carrying capacity. You'll see the carrying capacity there was 50 SDHs per 100 mils. And there's a steeper curve in response to density in that situation. When you have a lower stocking rate to begin with, so there's one there at 30 SDHs per 100 mils, you'll see the response to density much slower and lower. And right down the bottom end there's a big chunk of nothing happening, and they're properties with very low densities. And generally, as we say, below around 6 head per hectare, there is no effect of density. One of the other things that we noticed over time, and this was these 2 years here, 1 and 2 were 19 and 20. And again, you'll see that over time, the amount of rest, the recovery days that these properties were providing was increasing. So the blue curves, the blue lines there are properties that were already developed before and started some development before this project started. The orange lines are properties that increased to greater than 20 paddocks on their properties through that time frame, and the grey line was less than 20 paddocks. But even with less than 20 paddocks, and of these guys would have kicked off with 3-4 paddocks, but still using the time control principles, even with low paddock numbers. But the great thing was that as a result of the training and the support, over time, the amount of recovery days was increasing significantly across the project. But what we had here was a massive amount of data. So we had well, thousands and thousands of grazing days of data. I think actually it was more than that, up around 3 million grazing days of data in Maya. We also had economic data and production data across, anywhere up to about 100 properties over 3 to 4 years. And so we thought we're going to find some really, really good relationships out of that. But what we found was the reality. And so I want to use a model that I learned from Professor Stuart Hill. And Stuart says that there is simplicity. And so if we talk about things like just put things in terms of stocking rate or carrying capacity, that is simplicity. What producers are dealing with is complexity. And what we found in the data was complexity. But you cannot deal with the complexity that's actually involved in running a property. Too much going on. And certainly when we started to look at bigger databases, there was just, so period had a significant drought. We had some good rain. We had land prices go up by 20 to 30%. We had cattle prices go up by 30 to 50%. We had people destock during the drought. We had people that didn't have the finance to restock again after the drought, and et cetera, et cetera. And so once you start looking at across that scale, complexity of what's going on within the industry, simple analysis of that data couldn't pull us out a lot of information. So where we need to operate is at the level of profound simplicity. And so this is Stuart's model. He said there's simplicity, complexity, and profound simplicity is the other side of complexity. To do that, we use a series of principles. And these principles have evolved over the last 30 odd years, and they have changed over time. So the first principle of grazing management is plan, monitor, and manage. And I'll come back and talk a little bit more very briefly about that. The second principle is adjusting stocking, adjusting rest to suit plant growth. So there's a difference between overgrazing and overstocking. The second principle is to stop overgrazing. The third principle is matching stocking rate to carrying capacity, and that principle is to stop stocking. The fourth principle is managing livestock effectively. Now, this principle is animal production, and it's a massive principle. It covers distance to water, stocking rate match to carrying capacity, quality of water, you name it, and it's in that particular principle. The fourth principle is maximizing stock for minimum time. And this is the horsepower. It's a sexy part of the principle, but it's number 5 for a very, very good reason. It's taken us 30 years to get these principles to settle down and into the right order. And the final principle is managing for biodiversity. And if we look at what those principles actually do, the first principle is about and for people. It is people's decisions that make a difference to land. It's their decisions that make a difference to their business, to their animal production, and to their own lives. So people come first. The next 2 principles for the ecosystem. If you overgraze or you overstock, you will destroy or damage the ecosystem. Some of that can take a very long time to recover, although we've seen that we can recover it much, much faster than we would have thought. The fourth principle is about the business. So when we're looking at animal performance, animal production, we're talking gross margins, and gross margins are one of the key things that affect profitability within a business. The last 2 principles are for the ecosystem and the business itself. They're icing on the cake. So out of these 6 principles, the first 4 are the most critical in terms of making changes over time to the landscape. So I'll pull up there. Thank you.